Welcome to the podcast at the Diplomacy Next. We have changed over from the state of affairs to the Diplomacy Next because to make it more exclusive content and podcast for IR students and scholars. Apart from that, this is the 47th episode of this podcast on international relations. I'm being joined by Mr. Jagannath Panda, uh, who is working as a head at Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs. I would like to welcome him on the show. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Meera. It's a pleasure to be here.
We'll be talking about G20 and larger Indo-Pacific grouping and what's the India's role in the current geopolitical landscape. How about this thing, sir? You have written in the Diplomat about if India can use this, India must use this G20 presidency as a power that we can say in order to put the multipolar worldview across in order to make most of the use of G20 presidency. Can you begin with that, sir?
Well, I think G20 presidency is a great opportunity for India. If you see, not many multilateral organizations has a global connect, the kind of connect G20 is having currently. G20 in a way connects both, West and East. It establishes a greater networks among the global South, and in that way, it has a wider international connect when it comes to the global governance architecture. So G20 is a vital forum, vital international organizations. So India is privileged to be the president, the current president of the G20. But what is actually important to know here is that I think there has been a debate in recent past that G20 is losing out its importance. Of course, there is a kind of identity class between G7 and G20. Some experts would argue that because of the G20, G7 has lost its sign. Some would argue that G20 is still not a very effective organization when it comes to G7. So therefore, in that context, I think there is always a significance attached to G20 because G20 comes as an extension of G7 in some ways. Even though there are many countries who are new in the G20 formulations and they do not have the same identity and stature like the G7 countries. But still, G20 is a forum which gives a global connect to many powers. And to that extent, India is privileged to hold the presidency. And I think, therefore, it is an opportune time for India to hold the presidency for three specific reasons. One, it allows India to lead the global South process. Second, it also allows India to reiterate the faith on multilateralism because during the pandemic, there has been a significance lost on the faith on multilateral processes. We have seen the way China was dictating the WHO, World Health Organization. So not many countries were, not many people around the world were talking about the relevance of multilateral process. So I think there is an opportune time for India to revitalize the multilateral process in favor of the developing and emerging economies. Third, I think G7 allows India to connect with both richer and the poorer countries. The emerging and the emerged countries are the developing and the developed world. And therefore, India is at a critical zone in terms of not only enhancing its foreign policy, but also in terms of taking advantage of the post-pandemic process where the whole world expect India to play a leading role, particularly in the context of Indo-Pacific and beyond.
Thank you so much, sir, for this very elaborate understanding and articulation of the entire G20 thing. But that having been said, there's also one thing that scholars and students have to understand about this thing is that if G20 is a forum where India can actually put forward its worldview, it put forward its interests across the region and across the geopolitical landscape. But how do Indians and larger Indian foreign policy grid look at the entire G20 spectrum? Because there has to be a synergy of things because it has always been a dream come true when it comes to G20 presidency. So India as a country, how do Indians look at it?
Well, India is in a unique position because G20 is a forum which actually talks a lot about the global governance architecture, about the financial situation of the global politics, of the global scenario, and most importantly, talks about issues like unemployment, poverty. It also talks about revitalization of the economic situations around the world. So, therefore, um, given India's rising profile in the global politics and given the rising profile of Indian economy, I think this is an opportune time for India to talk about how to re-engage with the global economy. There has been a process where there has been a period over the last few years. There has been a talk that India is not really open to about connecting itself strongly with the global economy or with the free trade area environment. In fact, we have examples when India actually withdrawn from the regional comprehensive economic partnerships at the last moment, even though India was one of those prime countries and leading countries in the negotiation process of RCEP. But India decided to withdraw to protect its domestic interest, domestic economic interest. So therefore, there has been a cynicism about India as a greater economic actor in the world politics, particularly in the Indo-Pacific regions. So G20, in a way, provide a right fillip in terms of renovating that lost image or that dented image India was having for last few years. So therefore, this is an opportune moment for India to talk about how the poorer countries or the emerging economies, the developing economies should be connected with the developed economies when it comes to vital economy, vital governance issues like unemployment, poverty, um, you know, the global governance architecture, financial institutions, infrastructure development, sustainable development. These are the areas where India could play a critical role, including climate change, renewable energy, solar power, maritime governance, blue economy. These are the areas where India could actually play a critical role. India is a maritime country. India is a land-based country. India is a vital country which connects the Middle East with the Southeast Asian regions, constituting the core of the Indo-Pacific regions. So therefore, holding the presidency of G20 provide India a kind of leading position geographically and also on the maritime domain to talk about those areas which are becoming more critical in the post-pandemic period.
When we talk about this US-China competition and the strategy competition, what we have written in the diplomat, you also have mentioned about the middle powers and the opportunity for countries to, to decrease the increased dependence on the countries like US and China. And is it like G20 may get constrained and the India's position as a president of the G20 forum? Will it constrain India's strategic prowess, we can say, given what China and US have been doing at the strategic competitive field? Will it restrain India's G20 optimism?
I think if we go back to the history, history gives us a lesson. In each part of the history, there has been a episode of global power politics or global power rivalry. And many countries, including India, have navigated successfully through those periods. So we need to understand that the US-China rivalry is here to stay and he is here to grow. So therefore, India is not here to change the situation or try to play a constructive role in terms of diffusing their rivalry. Their rivalry is here to stay, and it is a superpower and a rising powers rivalry. The Thucydides trap or the Kindleberger trap, many would like to define the way US-China rivalry is emerging out to be. And I think this rivalry is going to be staying there. And therefore, there is little India could do. And therefore, when it comes to the G20 presidency, I don't think the US-China rivalry is going to affect much when it comes to India's leading role in terms of taking forward the G20 agenda. Even what we have seen that today, even though India is a G20 power, there are many other countries who have actually taken the presidency of the G20, and they have equally been caught in the superpower rivalry between US and China, or between US and Russia. So therefore, this power rivalry has been a constant variable in the global and regional politics. And this cannot be immediately changed. But what India can do is that I think India can be a mediating bridge on global governance issues, on global governance goods. And therefore, that there the strength of India lies. India is inching to become the most potent and the the most populous country in the world. And therefore, as the most populous country in the world, we have the merit to talk about the global governance issues, be it public health, be it public goods, or it be it the infrastructure or the sustainable developmental issues, including climate change issues. So the world governance process cannot overlook the issues that are attached to such a big population of the world politics, be it India or be it China for that regard, or be it the Asian politics or the Asian people and the Asian geopolitics is concerned. Therefore, India could potentially play a significant role when it comes to the G20 presidency.
And when we talk about the polarization within the G20 rankings, will it hinder the larger Indo-Pacific network and the grouping against China? If we can say that there has been, and the conflict and the strategic competition has anyways enhanced over the time, because recently we can say that a balloon just violated the airspace of US, and there have been comments across the embassies and pointed out at each other. What about that? Will G20 as a unit, as a forum, uh, act as a kind of a leverage against Chinese belligerence? If we can talk about that, sir.
I think China is melting down. In fact, if you see, after the 20th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, there is a softer tone is visible in the China's foreign policy, and particularly in Xi Jinping's approach. So China is going to mellow down a lot when it comes to its aggressive foreign policy, and therefore there is a greater synergy of convergence will be visible among China and many other countries in the world politics. But while saying that, I think every country are entitled to protect their national interest, including China. So I don't expect China to be flexible much flexible, and I don't also expect China to compromise on its core national security and territorial issues. So when it comes to the G20 forum, G20 forums are basically about global governance issues. And therefore, these are not essentially territorial issues or geopolitical complexities that actually are linked with the territorial and land boundary issues. So therefore, I think when it comes to the global governance issues, there is a greater affinity to have a more semblance, more compromising deal with China. And therefore, India can be one of those actors who could bring China to a more accountable position through its presidency in G20. While saying that, I think there are many gray areas where China needs to talk and bridge the gap between China and the rest of the world. We have seen during the pandemic, the gap between China and the rest of the world was constantly, enlarging, and this enlargement is there to stay for to some extent. It cannot be really narrowed down so quickly. So therefore, China has to be very flexible in terms of engaging with the outside world, and this is a period of opportunity. Therefore, for India to talk to China and mellow down a little bit on its aggressive foreign policy and try to manage the regional security environment. But while saying that, when it comes to boundary issues, when it comes to national security issues, territorial issues, maritime issues, we have not seen China compromising in anything. So we cannot ideally expect China to be a flexible power when it comes to sovereignty and territorial issues.
Coming back to India, sir, if we can say that what are the key important areas that researchers and students have to look up to when it comes to India's G20 presidency and the larger Indo-Pacific network in the next few years?
I think a number of areas. One is the sustainable developmental areas. I mean, within sustainable development, there are a lot of newly emerging areas like connectivity, infrastructure development, resilient infrastructure. These are the issues where the next generations are going to be benefited in terms of employment, in terms of opportunities, in terms of getting placements, in terms of having a much more collaborative environment with the global communities. So therefore, India could build a good regional plus global synergy through the G20 presidency. The other areas are like climate issues. The environmental protection is going to be one of those bigger issues. And therefore, we will see that India playing a very constructive role in terms of talking about climate change issues, how climate change should be, addressed immediately in favor of the emerging economies, because the emerging economies needs to, sustain their economy. And therefore, in that context, these are the areas where India would be actually talking loud. Then, apart from that, there are renewable energy as a area where India could be talking a lot and probably, focusing a lot through its G20 presidency. India is taking a lead when it comes to, International Solar Alliance program. And I think this is a critical forum where many countries has to come together in terms of not only strengthening the environment, but also, lessen the reliant on dependent energies like oil and gas. So therefore, we need to talk about renewable energy. We need to talk about solar power alliance. And I think these are the issues where G20 would be focusing a lot. Also, there are marine economic issues, blue economic issues, fisheries, and possibly, ecological developmental issues. Those will also be the highlighting story within India's presidency. As I mentioned earlier, that India is a maritime economic power. So therefore, India would be focusing on some of these areas to take advantage of the process. Apart from all of these things, I think the multilateral financial institutions are another critical area where India is expected to play a strong role. We have seen that, before the pandemic, there was a lot of institutions, those which quickly arrived with the lead of China primarily, and those are Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, where India has been a founding member, then New Development Bank of the BRICS. All of these banks and institutions, to some extent, has been beneficial for the emerging economies. But whether these institutions and financial institutions hold any credibility in the longer term, and I think those are the issues which will be discussed during India's presidency in G20. I think there we need a greater collaborations and convergence of strategic planning between the developed world and the developing world. And India would be playing a critical role in terms of taking forward some of these issues.
Coming back to this very new thing about India's Southeast Asian outreach, given that the Indo-Pacific things, how do you view as as a president in the G20? How is India actually? Is it just mounting its entire institutional framework when it comes to Southeast Asian countries? Has it intensified? Has India been able to navigate through all the constraints, strategic and other things that are involved when it comes to infrastructure building, when it comes to Southeast Asian outreach as countries with the developmental, manifesto, or with other convergence of strategic interests with all the countries in the Indo-Pacific, especially the ASEAN countries? How do you view the new developments in the region, sir?
The Southeast Asian region and the ASEAN region is a critical domain in Indian foreign policy. We have a first neighborhood, and also extended neighborhood policy. So Southeast Asian countries and the Southeast Asia as a region falls under both immediate, neighborhood, the first neighborhood policy framework, as well as under the extended neighborhood policy framework. So therefore, they are of critical importance to Indian foreign policy and India's future. While saying that, I think if we talk about ASEAN, if we talk about Southeast Asia, they have been focus of Indian foreign policy for last 3 decades. In fact, we know that it was the late Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao who actually talked about lookist policy, and then it was turned during the Modi government's when the last Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj under her tenure as Arctist policy. So there has been a transition and a gradual evolution from lookist to Arctist policy. And the whole intent and idea behind all of this policy driven is to stay engaged and to stay concretely engaged in specific areas when it comes to Southeast Asian region. So therefore, Southeast Asian region is vital for a number of regions for Indian foreign policy. And these areas are very critical areas. For example, connectivity, maritime connectivity. When it comes to trade and economy, this is a critical region for India in terms of for a greater goods collaborations and trading environment. When it comes to maritime domain, South China Sea is one of those critical regions where India has, a lot of interest, commercial interest. When it comes to energy resources, in the exploitation of the energy resources are concerned in the South China Sea regions. And each of these countries in Southeast Asia, they are critical to Indian foreign policy objectives. So therefore, Southeast Asia is a critical component in Indian foreign policy, and ASEAN is a significant institution in Indian foreign policy. And there should not be any compromise to that. But when today we are talking about Indo-Pacific in Indian foreign policy, so therefore, a lot of things has to evolve under or around that Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN regions. And India should not overlook those aspects. So therefore, when from India's point of view, when we are talking about Indo-Pacific policy, Southeast Asia and the ASEANs are going to figure out as the fulcrum of this India's Indo-Pacific strategy or outlook. We have seen that Prime Minister Modi, while talking about Sagar, security and growth for all in the regions, he has emphasized about the centrality of ASEAN. And that's a positive indications. But I think a lot has to be done. And I think free trading environment is one of those critical regions, critical area that India should be focusing on. India actually withdrawn from RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnerships, and there India needs to have a much more, collaborative effort in terms of thinking about whether to return to the RCEP framework or not. And I think there is an opportunity for India to go back to RCEP, and that will serve in India's purpose, because India is a rising economy. Its economy, its companies, its competitive middle class, lower middle class are getting international exposure. So to stay connected with the Southeast Asian economy is the minimum thing that has to be done in Indian foreign policy. So therefore, Southeast Asia, ASEAN are going to emerge as the critical variable in India's Indo-Pacific strategy, and there should not be any compromise with regard to that.
When it comes to US new fresh perspective on Indo-Pacific, sir, there has been a lot that's being talked about when it comes to US, relook at the entire Indo-Pacific strategy. What are the key developments, if there are any, we can talk about, sir?
I think we have to understand from American point of view. If we today look at the US Indo-Pacific strategy, when we talk about their defense and military stationing across the Indo-Pacific regions, they have almost 1,000 military stationing point all across the Indo-Pacific regions, and that's a huge setup. In order to sustain those security and military setups, they require constant engagement, continuous engagement with the partner countries or the like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific region. The second, I think American game plan is to also, continue to dominate the Indian Ocean regions, because Indian Ocean region is the energy hub, maritime zones, and therefore the American interests are massively attached to the Indian Ocean regions. While saying that the American interest is also not to deny, not to allow the Chinese to make easy inroads into the Indian Ocean, and therefore the way the Chinese are emerging as a naval power, we could see that they are going to challenge the American supremacy in the regions, and therefore the American game plan is to stay connected with the regions, particularly with the like-minded countries like India, Japan, Australia, and some of the Southeast Asian countries. So the synergy under Indo-Pacific regions is emerging. Quad is one of those them. Quad is one of those example. Then we have Malabar exercises. There are many other forums, including AUKUS, where the Americans are serious about protecting not only their interest, but also to engage with those countries who are not really, China friendly countries, including India. As we know that China-India rivalry is growing from time to time, and China is pushing India a multiple challenges, not only on the boundary issues, but also on a lot of foreign policy issues, including on the maritime domains. So I think it is in India's interest to be with the liberal world and with the American world in order to protect its maritime interest in times to come in the Indo-Pacific region.
One last thing, sir. After that, we'll just sign off. And that is a very important expected visit of Honorable Prime Minister to the US. What are the areas that we can see, given the greater convergence of interest between India and the US? The expected visit is possibly in this year only, and in the middle of this year. What are the areas that we can look forward to for the greater convergence of India and the US interests?
I think the fulcrum of US-India partnership is going to be trade and economy and the defense and security partnerships. When it comes to trade and economies, there are a lot of areas where both the sides are continuously talking. But one significant area which is emerging to be the defining aspect of US-India synergy is the defense trade. The defense trade component is emerging out to be the most important variable in US-India partnerships. The other areas are purely the defense and the security ties. We do have the 4 foundational agreement with the US, but there is an attempt to sign more agreements in order to strengthen the partnerships, not only in the airspace domain, but also on the satellites, on the naval sectors, and therefore this year 2023 is a critical year in terms of taking ahead the US-India partnerships. Also, what we are observing today is that there is a growing synergy is emerging between US and India when it comes to maritime domain, factoring the Indo-Pacific regions. So third country collaborations with Japan, with Australia, with some of the Southeast Asian countries are emerging out to be the critical variable in US-India partnerships. So US-India partnership is no more bilateral dimension, the bilateral centric. It is becoming multidimensional. It is becoming maritime dominated. It is becoming Indo-Pacific centric. And that's the fulcrum of US-India partnership today. And I think this year we'll see a lot happening on India-US relationship when it comes to the Indo-Pacific regions. And probably this is the beginning of a new chapter in US-India relationship in times to come.